It was supposed to be a moment of reverence, a royal solemn tribute to fallen heroes. The cameras were ready, the podium gleaming under the crisp Toronto morning sun, and yet, when Prince Harry finished his speech, no one clapped. Not a single hand moved. Not a cough, not a cheer, just the chilling hum of silence that stretched longer than anyone dared to measure. For a man who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with soldiers in Afghanistan, it was a silence heavier than gunfire. What happens when the applause dies, not by accident, but by choice? When a prince's words, meant to inspire, fall flat before the very men and women he once called brothers and sisters in arms. That moment, caught on dozens of phones and whispered across social media like wildfire, was more than awkward. It was symbolic. It was a reckoning. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Just days before Remembrance Day, Prince Harry flew into Toronto to begin what was billed as a goodwill visit. A tour meant to honor veterans, foster unity, and perhaps, quietly, redeem an image bruised by controversy. But from the moment his convoy rolled through the city's streets, something felt off. The energy was stiff, formal, polite, yes, but devoid of warmth. Toronto had welcomed the Duke of Sussex before, back when he was a hero of the Invictus Games. Back then, crowds cheered, flags waved, and soldiers saluted. This time, all he found were tight-lipped officers, wary glances, and a silence that spoke louder than any anthem. So what changed? Why did Canada, the nation Harry once called his second home, turn so cold? In the beginning, no one expected tension. The official itinerary looked harmless: wreath-laying ceremonies, veteran meet and greets, and a keynote speech for the Canadian Reserve Forces. But behind closed doors, officers were grumbling. Some felt his visit was political theater. Others saw hypocrisy. A prince who had traded military life for Netflix cameras, returning to preach about sacrifice. And then there were those who simply didn't want him there at all. What the world saw that morning wasn't just an awkward silence. It was a collective statement from people who felt betrayed. But here's the twist: it wasn't personal hate. It was disappointment. A deep, unspoken ache that came from watching someone they once admired drift so far from the man they thought they knew. Still, Harry walked onto that stage believing he could win them over. He straightened his tie, glanced briefly at the flag beside him, and began his speech with the confidence of someone who once commanded respect by just standing still. His voice carried through the hall, steady and rehearsed. He spoke about brotherhood, about the bond between soldiers, about courage in times of chaos. The words were flawless, the delivery smooth. But the problem wasn't the speech, it was the man giving it. Because in that room sat veterans who remembered when Harry said he'd been trapped in royal duty. Men who had served proudly and lost friends in the field, listening to a prince who had publicly stepped away from service life for celebrity projects. Every line he delivered, no matter how sincere, seemed to echo against an invisible wall of mistrust. When he paused for emphasis, nothing. No nods. No murmurs of approval. Just the echo of his own voice bouncing back at him. And then came the ending. The part where, by tradition, the room would rise in applause. Harry finished, looked up with a faint smile, waiting for that wave of gratitude he had grown used to. Instead, the stillness deepened. One soldier shifted in his seat. Another looked at the floor. The MC hesitated, forcing a quick thank you before moving on. Cameras flashed. The moment passed. But in the seconds that followed, you could see it in Harry's eyes. Confusion, then realization, then something else: hurt. The footage would later go viral, captioned with brutal precision. No one clapped. It was more than a meme, it was a message. But this wasn't the first time Harry had faced cold reception from a crowd meant to honor him. In recent years, his relationship with military organizations across the Commonwealth has quietly fractured. Many veterans feel he abandoned the very institution that once defined him. His exit from royal duties didn't just strip him of titles, it stripped him of credibility in their eyes. And Canada, once a soft landing spot for the Sussexes, was now standing as the first nation to openly display that disillusionment. Yet, this wasn't an accident. Some insiders claimed the reserve forces had been briefed beforehand, to maintain professionalism, to stay measured. No boos. No heckling. But no applause either. A silent, disciplined form of protest. Respect for the uniform, not the man wearing it. It was subtle, but powerful. And Harry, perhaps unaware of how deep that quiet resentment ran, walked straight into it. Imagine for a moment what that must have felt like. To be a man who once wore the same fatigues, saluted the same flag, now facing the cold judgment of those same brothers and sisters. He wasn't being jeered. He wasn't being heckled. He was being ignored. And in the military, that's far worse. Because silence isn't absence. It's a verdict. But why did it sting so much? Maybe because Harry's entire public identity has been built on being heard, on using his voice to challenge the old order, to speak his truth. And now, in the one place where his words should have carried the most weight, they carried none at all. It's ironic, isn't it? The man who once created the Invictus Games, a beacon for injured and recovering soldiers, now standing before veterans who refuse to acknowledge him. Was it a fall from grace or a wake-up call? Was it rejection or reflection? For years, Harry has tried to balance two worlds, the royal and the real. But that balance has wobbled since he stepped away from the firm. Every public appearance now feels like a test of loyalty, his and everyone else's. When he speaks, people listen not to his message, but to the subtext. Is he genuine? Is this for charity or for cameras? The lines have blurred so much that even his most heartfelt gestures now invite skepticism. In Toronto? Toronto remembered. They remembered the glamour of his earlier visits. The handshakes, the smiles, the Invictus speeches that once moved crowds to tears. But they also remembered the aftermath, the interviews, the book, the public airing of family grievances. The Harry they saw on stage wasn't the soldier prince. He was the celebrity advocate, polished and fragile all at once. And that version didn't fit in this hall of medals and discipline. So when the applause didn't come, it wasn't spontaneous. It was earned by absence, by a decade of choices that distanced him from the very values he once embodied. But here's where it gets more complex. Because while the silence made global headlines, few people knew the story behind it. Few knew that weeks before the visit, internal discussions among the Canadian Reserve Forces debated whether to even host him. Some argued that Harry's presence would draw attention to veteran issues. Others argued it would overshadow them entirely. In the end, they agreed to proceed, but under conditions that ensured the event remained about the soldiers, not the Sussex brand. And that's exactly what happened. The soldiers showed restraint. They let him speak. But when it was done, they reclaimed the narrative with silence. Harry left the podium, walked off stage, and for a brief second, the cameras caught his face. It wasn't anger, it was shock. He looked around as if expecting someone, anyone, to break the ice. But the ice didn't break. It thickened. In that frozen moment, a prince learned something most public figures never do, that silence can be more powerful than words. Back in the green room, aides scrambled to reframe it. They whispered about somber respect, about military protocol. But everyone in that building knew the truth. It wasn't protocol, it was protest. And here's the part the press didn't show. After the ceremony, when Harry met a group of veterans privately, some were polite but distant. One reportedly refused to shake his hand. Another simply nodded and walked away. For a man who built his reputation on camaraderie, that distance must have cut deep. Still, in his mind, he had done the right thing. He showed up. He spoke from the heart. But what he didn't realize was that showing up wasn't enough anymore. Not when his words no longer carried trust. Because this wasn't just about a speech. It was about legacy. About how one man's choices rippled across oceans and through ranks. Canada's silent reception wasn't random. It was reflective. A mirror held up to Harry's journey from the front lines of war to the front pages of tabloids. And as the sun set over Toronto that evening, the contrast was sharp. Outside the venue, a few fans waved small British flags, shouting his name. But inside the military circles, the message had already spread. We heard him. We just didn't believe him. Now, you might wonder, was this silence the end of something? Or the beginning of something worse? Because while the event was over, the consequences were only just beginning to unfold. Within hours, footage of the moment hit social media. Journalists dissected every second of it. Analysts debated whether it was an act of defiance or mere awkwardness. But those who were there knew it was intentional. And soon, whispers began to surface. Whispers of a letter. A letter circulated among officers before the visit, outlining exactly why many didn't support his attendance. A letter that, if true, would expose just how fractured Harry's bond with the military community had become. A letter that could turn polite silence into global scandal. But before that letter made its way into the headlines, Harry's team went into damage control. Press statements, selective photos, and PR-friendly captions tried to reshape the narrative. A moment of solemn reflection, one post read. But the internet wasn't buying it. Because the silence, once seen, couldn't be unseen. And that's where the story truly begins. Not in the silence itself, but in what that silence uncovered. It wasn't just about one speech. It was about reputation, loyalty, and the cost of losing touch with one's roots. And it left everyone asking, could Prince Harry ever bridge the gap again? Or had he finally crossed a line he could never return from? Because what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The flight touched down just after dawn, slicing through the thin layer of November fog that hung over Toronto's Pearson International Airport. The air was cold, sharp enough to bite through tailored coats and expensive smiles. A small delegation of local officials stood at the tarmac, clutching clipboards and coffee cups, their breath fogging in the morning chill. They had been told to expect the Duke of Sussex, but few seemed eager. One leaned to another and whispered, "This isn't going to go the way they think." From the moment Prince Harry stepped off the plane, the atmosphere felt restrained. No cheering crowd, no waving flags, just the distant hum of service vehicles and the clack of cameras doing their job out of obligation rather than excitement. The photographers, contracted by royal PR teams, took their pictures with robotic precision. Flash, step, flash again. Harry smiled as he always did, trying to look confident, but the edges of his grin betrayed something else, uncertainty. You could see it in the way he adjusted his jacket, the slight glance toward the reception line as if searching for a familiar face. He'd been told the trip was a strategic engagement, part of a remembrance tour meant to highlight his lifelong commitment to veterans. But behind the scenes, everyone knew this wasn't just about commemoration, it was about redemption. After months of media turmoil, Netflix criticism, and dwindling public affection, this was supposed to be the reset, the return of the soldier prince. The problem? No one seemed to want him back. A single black SUV idled nearby, waiting to whisk him away to his first stop, a veterans facility just outside downtown Toronto. The itinerary had been polished and rehearsed. Every handshake, every photo op, every carefully worded statement about duty and remembrance had been approved. And yet, what no one could choreograph was the mood of the people he was about to face. As the convoy pulled onto the highway, Harry looked out through the tinted windows. Toronto's skyline shimmered against the pale sky, cold and distant. He had been here before, years ago, back when the city welcomed him as a hero. The 2017 Invictus Games had made headlines, showcasing his charisma and heart. Crowds had cheered for the prince who cared, the soldier who understood pain. It was here, too, that Meghan Markle had made her first public appearance beside him, the world watching as a fairy tale bloomed. Those were the good days. But now, Toronto felt different. It wasn't just the weather, it was the silence. When the convoy reached the Veterans Center, a few local press outlets waited outside. Their headlines were already pre-written. Prince Harry visits Canada for Remembrance Commemoration. A harmless line, stripped of controversy. But inside the building, a quiet tension simmered. The Canadian Reserve Forces officers lined up in crisp uniforms, their expressions polite but unreadable. There were no personal greetings, no warm gestures of familiarity. Just salutes executed with mechanical precision. Respect for the title, not the man. One veteran later described it perfectly. It felt like shaking hands with a ghost from a different war. Inside the hall, Harry met with the event coordinators and several senior officials. They exchanged formal pleasantries, but beneath the polished conversation, everyone knew they were walking on thin ice. Some attendees had voiced discomfort even before the visit. They didn't see him as one of them anymore. The uniform he once wore was long gone. The medals, though real, had become symbols of a past he'd seemingly discarded for fame and fortune. Still, Harry tried. He shook hands, smiled for cameras, and shared a few anecdotes from his military years. For a moment, you could see the spark that once made him so beloved. The humor, the ease, the human touch that used to win rooms over in seconds. But this room was different. The laughter, when it came, was short-lived, almost forced. Every sentence he spoke hung in the air, searching for warmth that wasn't there. There's an unspoken rule among soldiers. Loyalty runs deep, but so does accountability. You can leave the army, but you can't abandon the brotherhood. And for many in that room, that's exactly what Harry had done. He wasn't the young captain who shared beer with troops in dusty tents anymore. He was the celebrity prince living in Montecito, giving interviews about trauma while critics accused him of monetizing the very institution he once swore to protect. Did he realize how that looked? Maybe. Because when a reporter casually asked what this visit meant to him, his answer stumbled. It's, about remembrance, he said, pausing to find the words. About honoring service and sacrifice. The same line he'd said 100 times before. But this time it rang hollow. Back in the control room, event staff whispered. This isn't landing, one murmured. The other just sighed. No, it's not. The real discomfort came later, when Harry stepped outside to greet the small crowd that had gathered along the barricades. A few curious onlookers waved politely. Some held their phones high to record. But unlike previous royal tours, there was no cheering, no spontaneous applause. Just polite nods and murmurs. And that's when one soldier, standing near the line, muttered under his breath to a colleague. He shouldn't have come. You see, the visit was never meant to be controversial. But weeks earlier, internal emails within the reserve forces had revealed something telling. Many officers felt blindsided by his inclusion. Some believed his presence would distract from the central message of remembrance events. Others worried about optics. This can't look like a PR tour, one email read. We honor service, not spectacle. The phrase would prove prophetic. As the day continued, Harry's team grew increasingly nervous. The schedule moved smoothly on paper, but every appearance felt colder than the last. Even the local press coverage was restrained, careful not to stir emotion one way or another. The reporters asked predictable questions. Harry gave predictable answers. It was all very procedural. Yet under the surface, resentment was brewing. Among the veterans in attendance, some quietly whispered their frustrations. One had served under NATO operations during Harry's active years. He spoke quietly to a journalist afterward. We respected him. We did. But now it feels like he's using us to rebuild his image. The words carried weight because they echoed what many had been thinking but few dared to say aloud. By afternoon, Harry's team tried to shake things up. They arranged a private visit to a rehabilitation unit where wounded veterans were undergoing therapy. It was supposed to be the emotional centerpiece of the day, the kind of moment that humanized him, reminded people of his genuine empathy. Cameras were kept minimal to preserve intimacy, but one staffer who was present said later, it didn't feel authentic. He asked good questions, but you could tell everyone was guarded. It wasn't anger, it was fatigue. One veteran, confined to a wheelchair, smiled politely when Harry knelt beside him. Good to see you again, Harry said softly. The man replied, we all change, sir. That was it. For words that lingered longer than any speech. And that's the thing. Sometimes indifference cuts deeper than hostility. Harry wasn't being confronted. He was being dismissed. Politely. Professionally. Completely. As the day wound down, he was scheduled for a short press conference before returning to his hotel. The team rehearsed his talking points one last time. Keep it light, his aide advised. Focus on unity, remembrance, and gratitude. But even the aides knew they were swimming upstream. The story of the day wasn't what he said, it was how people reacted. Or rather, how they didn't. The press conference ended with the usual gestures, a wave, a thank you, a polite exit. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled, and yet, the atmosphere remained flat. Outside, Harry slipped into his car, visibly drained. Through the tinted window, he watched as soldiers walked away, chatting casually among themselves. None turned back. None lingered. It was as if his presence had never mattered. Back at his hotel, his phone buzzed nonstop. Messages from PR advisors in London, assistants in California, and royal watchers from around the world. They all wanted to know the same thing. How had it gone? His answer, sent quietly to a close aide, was brief. It was fine. But those two words hid everything. Because deep down, he knew it wasn't. Later that evening, as he sat by the window overlooking the Toronto skyline, He found himself remembering his first trip here years ago. Back then, he was still the charming rebel prince, the soldier who had something to prove, the son trying to find meaning beyond the crown. But now, he was a man caught between worlds, neither accepted by the royals he'd left behind, nor embraced by the communities he claimed to represent. The silence of that day followed him into the night. Meanwhile, back at the Veterans Center, whispers continued. Some soldiers defended his intentions. At least he showed up, one said. Others scoffed. He showed up for himself. The divide was clear, but the sentiment leaned heavily toward indifference. The event had been endured, not celebrated. And somewhere in that mix, the first signs of something bigger began to emerge. A letter. A message shared among officers that would soon make headlines. A letter that expressed exactly why so many had grown tired of the man who once inspired them. But that revelation was still days away. For now, the silence of his arrival would become the prelude to a storm. Because this trip, meant to restore faith, was already slipping into controversy. The palace had hoped for headlines about remembrance and unity. Instead, the whispers growing inside Canadian ranks would soon reach every corner of the internet. And when that letter surfaced, it wouldn't just embarrass him. It would expose the truth behind the silence that started it all. As the night deepened and city lights glimmered below his hotel window, Harry probably believed the worst was over. The speeches were done, the ceremonies complete. Tomorrow, he thought, would bring a better reception. But fate, and the Canadian Reserve Forces, had other plans. Because the next morning, something unexpected began to circulate quietly among soldiers and journalists alike. A document. A single-page statement that explained why no one had clapped, why no one had cheered, and why that silence wasn't just a coincidence. It was deliberate. And that letter would become the spark that turned one awkward visit into an international scandal. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. When Prince Harry took the stage at the Canadian Reserve Forces Remembrance Day event, the air was thick with expectation and tension. You could feel it in the way the soldiers shifted, the way officers tapped their boots against the floor, and in the faint rustle of papers as journalists fumbled for notes. Onlookers might have assumed this was a routine ceremony, one of those polished, respectful gatherings that the royals excel at. But in reality, the room was brimming with quiet defiance. And it all began before a single word left Harry's mouth. A military salute, when genuine, is a gesture of honor. When forced, it's a formality. But when the room collectively decides not to applaud, the silence carries weight that even the loudest cheers cannot match. That day, the reserve forces made a choice, a decision to withhold validation from the man who had once been one of their own. And that silence would reverberate far beyond the walls of the hall. From the first moment Harry stepped forward, he could sense it. The energy was polite, even cordial on the surface, but it lacked warmth. Smiles were tight-lipped, handshakes firm but brief. Eyes flicked to the floor, to the ceiling, to anything but the speaker. It was as if invisible threads of judgment connected every uniformed body in that room, silently communicating. We remember who you were, but we do not endorse who you've become. Some veterans later explained it simply. They didn't want to participate in a staged PR event. They didn't want their service reduced to a backdrop for celebrity redemption. We've seen this before, one retired officer told a journalist. You show up, shake some hands, say a few lines, and the cameras roll. But the people you're here for? They see right through it. That sentiment captured the mood perfectly, polite but calculated resistance. And it wasn't just a handful of dissenters. It was systematic. Those who had served under Harry during his military years, who once trusted him implicitly, were now bound by protocol, but they weren't bound to applause. The moment he finished each line, every carefully crafted phrase meant to inspire camaraderie and reflection, the room remained unmoved. Not a nod, not a single round of applause. Their silence wasn't disrespectful. It was deliberate. It was disciplined. It was a protest in its purest, most restrained form. Some of the younger soldiers, unfamiliar with Harry's past, seemed confused by the quiet. They expected the prince to command attention, to elicit cheers by virtue of his title. But the veterans, those who had felt the weight of leadership and the cost of loyalty, knew better. They understood that respect is earned, not granted, and that sometimes, withholding it speaks louder than words. Inside that hall, Harry tried to maintain his composure. His tone was measured, calm, almost rehearsed. He spoke about honor, courage, and sacrifice. He referenced shared experiences, from training exercises to deployment stories, attempting to bridge the gap between the celebrity and the soldier. But the room didn't bite. They listened politely, but they didn't respond. It was a wall of quiet, unyielding, and impossible to ignore. Observers would later note the subtle signs of Harry's discomfort. A slight tightening of the jaw, a blink too long, fingers tapping against the podium. Every subtle gesture, every micro-expression, betrayed the fact that he expected a reaction and didn't receive one. Human beings, after all, are wired to respond to social cues. Applause isn't just a courtesy, it's affirmation. And when it was withheld, the effect was palpable. Behind the scenes, the silence had been planned, or at least anticipated. Weeks prior, discussions among the Canadian Reserve Forces leadership debated the appropriateness of Harry's visit. Some officers argued for outright refusal, citing past grievances and public controversies surrounding his departure from the royal family. Others suggested they could accommodate the visit, but only under strict conditions. No staged applause, no public fanfare, and no ceremonial embellishments. It wasn't personal. It was about maintaining dignity and ensuring the focus remained on veterans rather than the prince. But as the event unfolded, Harry couldn't see the calculus behind the silence. He only saw empty expressions and unmoved bodies. And that, perhaps, stung more than any criticism. Because when you've lived in the spotlight, you become accustomed to validation. You expect to be heard, applauded, and praised. Silence is jarring. Silence is judgment. Silence is exposure. For veterans, though, the decision was strategic. They didn't want to embarrass him. They wanted to make a statement without confrontation. They wanted to communicate that loyalty isn't unconditional, and that admiration is earned through actions, not titles. Their protest was subtle, almost invisible to the casual observer, but its impact was profound. The room's quiet sent a message. Your past service doesn't excuse your present choices. Some journalists noted the contrast between Harry's expectations and the reality. In previous tours, his presence had inspired enthusiasm, even adoration. Now, there was respect for the uniform, yes, but none for the man wearing it. The silence felt deliberate, like a collective pause that demanded reflection. Are you still one of us? Or have you stepped too far from the values you once embodied? And it wasn't just the silence itself, it was the moments within it. Soldiers exchanging glances, small nods that communicated agreement without breaking decorum. One officer later recounted that whispers circulated about how Harry's public image had drifted too far from the discipline and humility expected of someone claiming to represent the military. The unspoken consensus was clear. If you want to reclaim respect, you have to earn it anew. Emotional tension built throughout the speech. Harry shifted from one talking point to the next, each phrase carefully designed to resonate. He spoke of courage under fire, the bonds of brotherhood, and the sacrifices that soldiers make daily. But for those in the audience, words were no longer enough. Actions mattered. And in their eyes, his recent choices, Netflix deals, interviews, and his distancing from the Royal Military Network diminished his credibility. At one point, a veteran whispered to a colleague, "We admired him once. Now we just watch." That quiet acknowledgement summed up the room's collective mood. Admiration wasn't gone, exactly. It had been replaced by guarded observation. The soldiers were measuring, assessing, waiting to see if Harry's words aligned with his deeds. Even the younger members of the reserve forces, initially confused, began to understand. They noticed the tension in the room, the subtle signs of resistance, the absence of expected applause. Some felt sympathy for Harry, others felt disappointment. The divide highlighted an essential truth: respect is multifaceted. You can honor the office while questioning the individual. You can listen without endorsing. Harry's aides, standing off to the side, watched the scene unfold with rising concern. They whispered updates to each other, reminders of PR talking points, and suggestions to maintain eye contact with key supporters. But in a room dominated by disciplined veterans, tactics mattered less than sincerity. And in that moment, sincerity, or perceived lack thereof, was the issue. By the time Harry finished his speech, The silence had solidified into an unmistakable statement. No one moved. No one clapped. Polite smiles were frozen in place. Cameras flashed mechanically, capturing images that would later travel around the world. And in that silence, Harry's realization sank in. This wasn't a routine ceremony. This was judgment. But the veterans' protest didn't end there. After the formalities, conversations unfolded quietly in corners. Some shared stories of past deployments with peers, referencing Harry's previous service with a mix of nostalgia and critique. Others discussed the optics, analyzing how his public actions diverged from his military persona. The consensus, whispered yet firm, was that respect couldn't be assumed, it had to be earned. And that assumption, for Harry, had faltered. Interestingly, some officers later described the act not as defiance, but as an opportunity. The silent protest was meant to be instructive, a chance to remind the prince that legacy isn't inherited. It's built. The absence of applause was intentional, a subtle classroom for one of their own who had drifted from the code they valued most. And yet, even as strategic as it was, the emotional impact on Harry was undeniable. The rest of the day would unfold in a series of similar moments. Handshakes that lingered just long enough to make contact awkward, small nods that replaced words of praise, and fleeting smiles that never quite reached the eyes. Every interaction reinforced a single truth. The veterans were keeping him at arm's length. Their protest wasn't loud, but it was effective. And somewhere in the midst of it all, the first whispers of a circulating letter began. Officers quietly passing a page among themselves, detailing exactly why Harry's presence had become contentious. The letter outlined grievances, reflected the mood of the military community, and served as both a warning and a historical record. No one outside the room knew about it yet, but it would eventually make headlines and expose the depth of disapproval Harry faced. By evening, Harry returned to his hotel, tired but perhaps not fully aware of the significance of what had transpired. For him, the day may have seemed awkward but manageable. For the Canadian Reserve Forces, however, the silent protest was a victory. They had demonstrated that respect is deliberate, earned, and never automatic, even for royalty. And yet, despite all this, the most dramatic moments had not yet occurred. That letter, the quiet whispers, and the growing online storm were still in their infancy. What seemed like polite resistance was about to explode into a story that would dominate headlines, social media, and global discussion for days to come. Because when silence speaks louder than applause, the consequences can be far-reaching, and what came next would change everything. It was never meant to see the light of day. A single-page document, circulated quietly among senior Canadian Reserve Forces officers in the days leading up to Prince Harry's Remembrance Day visit, had been intended as internal guidance, a note of caution, a subtle expression of disapproval. But in today's hyper-connected world, nothing stays secret for long. By the time Harry stepped onto the stage, that letter had begun to shape the atmosphere in ways no one, not even the palace, could have anticipated. The letter's origins were mundane yet significant. Drafted by a retired officer who had served alongside Harry during his military tenure, it outlined concerns about the visit. The message was polite on the surface but firm in its underlying critique. Every officer who received it was instructed to read it carefully, consider its points, and let its spirit guide their participation in the ceremonies. No one was to speak of it publicly, yet its influence on the collective mindset was profound. What made the letter extraordinary wasn't just its content, it was the timing. It arrived days before Harry's arrival, just as internal briefings were being finalized. Veterans who had once admired the prince found themselves questioning his motives. Some saw a man attempting to reclaim his former glory. Others saw a celebrity intruding into spaces meant for remembrance, not performance. The letter crystallized these feelings, giving them a voice and, crucially, a directive. When Harry finally addressed the room, the letter had already set the tone. Its lines, passed hand to hand, had emphasized restraint. Show respect, but do not feign admiration. Maintain professionalism, yes, but applause was optional. Approval was not guaranteed. Veterans, reading the carefully worded criticisms, had internalized a silent code of conduct. They knew that when Harry finished speaking, no hands would clap, no cheers would rise. It was subtle defiance, a disciplined, strategic response. And yet, the letter itself carried weight far beyond the room. It highlighted everything Harry had hoped to avoid. The perception that he had drifted from his roots, that his celebrity ventures overshadowed his previous commitments, that his public statements no longer resonated with those who had fought alongside him. It wasn't hateful, it was reflective, a record of disappointment. A mirror held up to someone who once embodied the values now being quietly questioned. What did the letter say exactly? According to sources who later revealed portions to the media, it reminded officers that while Harry had once served with distinction, recent actions, public interviews, television appearances, and distancing from traditional military circles had eroded trust. The letter advised, exercise discretion in engagement. Politeness is required. Enthusiasm is optional. Respect the uniform and the institution, not the individual. That advice became the invisible framework for the silent protest that unfolded in the hall. Every hesitation, every measured glance, every muted response traced its origin to those written words. When Harry looked out across the room, expecting recognition, he saw the physical manifestation of that letter: restraint, reserve, and refusal to offer unearned applause. And there was more. The letter didn't merely critique, it contextualized. It recounted instances in which Harry's celebrity-focused ventures, in the eyes of some veterans, undermined his credibility. References to media deals, public interviews about personal trauma, and perceived opportunistic philanthropy were sprinkled throughout. It didn't condemn him outright. It simply reminded readers that credibility must be earned every day, and that symbolic gestures, no matter how polished, could not erase the past. One officer later described the effect of reading the letter in the days before the ceremony. It wasn't about being rude, he said. It was about clarity. We had to act in a way that preserved the integrity of the event. That letter reminded us why we couldn't just clap out of habit or protocol. We had to think, does this action honor the soldiers or the celebrity? That subtle framing turned a room full of disciplined professionals into a single organism, moving and reacting as one. When Harry spoke, the letter's influence manifested in the perfect silence that greeted each phrase. The applause that might have accompanied a generic ceremonial speech never came. Even those who felt some residual affection for him complied with the implicit directive: politeness first, endorsement optional. But the letter also had an unintended consequence. Once the ceremony was over, snippets began to circulate outside the room. Veterans who felt compelled to explain the quiet shared the letter's points with trusted journalists. The internet, of course, amplified these fragments. Soon, the story was no longer about the visit itself. It became about why no one clapped. Social media users, hungry for drama, framed it as open defiance, generating viral memes and commentary. Ignored by soldiers, read one headline. Prince Harry snubbed on Canadian soil, read another. And through it all, the quiet guidance of one carefully drafted page became the catalyst for global conversation. Inside the hall, the effect on Harry was palpable. By the time he reached the end of his speech, he had noticed the absence of applause. But he did not yet understand why. That understanding would come later, once the letter's existence and content became public knowledge. But for now, he experienced a mixture of confusion, frustration, and disbelief. To him, the silence was a mystery. To those who had read the letter, it was deliberate and entirely predictable. Even the palace and his aides were caught off guard. They had anticipated measured reception, perhaps cautious attention, but not the level of coordination that the letter had inspired. Some aides later admitted to journalists that they only realized the letter's influence in retrospect, once they reviewed the footage and spoke with attendees. What had seemed like awkward timing or random hesitation was, in fact, a coordinated, intentional act. The letter also hinted at the deeper emotions driving the protest. It referenced disappointment, a sense of betrayal, and the erosion of trust. It was not personal animosity. It was a moral and professional judgment. Veterans were asserting that while Harry had once been one of them, recent choices had created a rift that could not be bridged by ceremonial appearances alone. And that was a lesson he had to absorb, not publicly, not on stage, but internally, as he processed the reception. Perhaps most shocking, however, was the level of transparency the letter implied. Veterans didn't hide their reasoning behind vague statements. They articulated it clearly, concisely, and without malice. They acknowledged Harry's past contributions while pointing out the gulf between then and now. The guidance it provided was simultaneously a reprimand and a roadmap, urging professionals to maintain decorum while withholding unearned admiration. That duality, the balance of respect and critique, is what made the silent protest so potent. And once the letter leaked, intentionally or not, the story took on new dimensions. Headlines highlighted the dissonance between the prince's expectations and the reality he faced. Social media erupted with debates about loyalty, service, and celebrity accountability. Commentators weighed in from around the world, dissecting every moment of the ceremony through the lens of the leaked document. Some were sympathetic, arguing that veterans were being overly harsh. Others praised the principled stand, framing it as a necessary check on entitlement and celebrity culture. By evening, the narrative had solidified. Harry's visit was no longer just an event. It had become a case study in perception, expectation, and consequence. The letter, once a quiet internal note, was now a symbol of accountability. And for Harry, the impact was both public and personal. His reputation as a soldier prince had been tested, not by confrontation or criticism, but by silence guided by written instruction. But the story didn't end there. As news outlets scrambled to cover the visit, the letter became a focal point. Analysts debated the motivations behind it, historians examined its implications for Commonwealth military relations, and fans weighed in online, some defending Harry, others condemning him. The carefully orchestrated silence, informed by a single page of guidance, had triggered a cascade of consequences that no one in the room could have predicted. And while the public discussion raged, another layer of drama was unfolding behind the scenes. Within Harry's team, there were whispers of leaked documents, questions about security, and growing concern about the narrative spiraling out of control. The letter had done more than influence the veterans. It had become a catalyst for media frenzy, diplomatic unease, and personal reckoning. Because in that silence, and in that leaked letter, Harry faced a truth he could not ignore. Respect, it seemed, could not be bought with appearances, polished speeches, or celebrity status. It had to be earned, maintained, and honored through actions aligned with values. And for the man who had once commanded respect effortlessly, that lesson was coming in the harshest, quietest way imaginable. What came next would push the story from silent protest into full-blown controversy, and no one was prepared for the consequences that it started as a few shaky cell phone recordings. A veteran's child, standing near the edge of the ceremony hall, had discreetly filmed the final moments of Prince Harry's speech. At first, no one thought much of it, just another social media clip among hundreds that captured the morning's events. But as soon as the footage was uploaded, the world began to see what those inside the hall already knew. The silence wasn't awkward, it wasn't a mistake, it was deliberate. The first thing that struck viewers was the length of it. Harry finished his carefully worded speech, paused for the customary applause, and nothing happened. Just quiet. The camera lingered, catching the subtle tension in the room. Soldiers shifted in their seats, officers exchanged glances, and the faint shuffle of papers was the only sound. For someone who had spent his life in the spotlight, accustomed to instant recognition and adoration, this was uncharted territory. Social media users were quick to react. Clips went viral in minutes, shared with captions dripping in sarcasm and disbelief. The Duke of Sussex, Prince Harry, unclapped, royal snub in Canada. Hashtags trended, memes were born, and within hours, the narrative was no longer just about the visit. It was about the humiliation. Analysts dissected frame by frame. Harry's micro-expressions, the subtle tightening of his jaw, the way he scanned the audience, his faint, almost imperceptible sigh. Every detail became a talking point. For Harry, the impact of the footage was immediate and visceral. His aides began receiving frantic messages from London and Los Angeles. PR consultants called, emails buzzed, and advisors flooded group chats with strategies. Every possible spin had already been exhausted, and yet the clip continued to spread uncontrollably. The panic that had simmered during the visit escalated into full-blown crisis mode. Behind the scenes, the palace monitored the situation closely. Analysts and aides ran the footage repeatedly, examining Harry's demeanor and the reactions of the veterans. The silence, though subtle, was unmistakable. A few officers had deliberately withheld any form of applause, and the camera caught it. This was no mere lapse in etiquette. It was a coordinated, intentional statement. And now, the world could see it. The emotional impact on Harry was significant. For decades, he had relied on social validation to gauge his influence. Applause, cheers, public approval. It was the currency of affirmation. Now, in one brief clip, that currency was stripped away. He could no longer rely on assumption or expectation. The evidence was visible, tangible, and undeniable. Silence, in this case, was more devastating than confrontation. What made the footage particularly potent was its relatability. Unlike carefully orchestrated PR images, this clip captured authentic human reactions. The soldiers weren't posing for the camera, they weren't performing for an audience. Their restraint, born from internal guidance and the leaked letter, was raw and unfiltered. Viewers around the world could see the contrast between Harry's polished delivery and the measured indifference of the veterans. And that contrast was explosive. The spread of the footage also exposed a larger issue: Harry's perception of his own legacy versus how it was viewed by those who had once respected him most. Analysts noted that the silent protest highlighted the gap between intention and reception. While Harry had intended to honor the veterans and showcase his commitment to service, the visual evidence suggested a man out of touch with the people he sought to impress. The irony was stark and brutal. Social media became the arena of judgment. Memes proliferated, emphasizing the emptiness of the applause. Tweets sarcastically described the Duke as ignored by his former brothers in arms and snubbed in a room full of respect. Some commentators speculated about his mental state, questioning whether he anticipated such a reaction. Others, more sympathetic, argued that his past contributions should shield him from criticism. The debate was global, consuming headlines and dominating comment threads across platforms. Meanwhile, inside Harry's team, panic turned to desperation. Strategies were hastily drafted to counter the narrative. One idea involved releasing a curated selection of photos showing him shaking hands with individual veterans, attempting to create an impression of warmth and engagement. Another involved issuing statements emphasizing the solemnity of the occasion, framing the silence as a mark of reverence rather than disapproval. Yet every attempt to control the narrative was undermined by the footage itself. Authenticity cannot be faked, and the soldiers' expressions spoke louder than any press release. Interestingly, the footage also had a ripple effect beyond Canada. Across the Commonwealth, military observers and royal commentators analyzed the clip, noting the subtle cues of dissent. Some interpreted it as evidence of widespread disillusionment with Harry's public persona. Others saw it as a strategic protest, reflecting a desire to separate admiration for his past service from endorsement of his present choices. The clip became a lens through which the public examined not just Harry, but the broader tension between celebrity, duty, and institutional loyalty. Veterans, for their part, watched the viral spread of the footage with mixed feelings. Some expressed satisfaction that their message had reached a wider audience. Others worried about potential backlash, fearing that public interpretation could misrepresent their intentions. For them, the point was never humiliation, it was accountability. The clip captured a lesson they hoped Harry would internalize. Respect is earned through consistent action, not inherited through title or celebrity. As for Harry, the personal impact was unmistakable. Interviews later revealed that he was unsettled by the starkness of the images. Even supportive aides admitted that the footage conveyed a truth he could not ignore. A tangible gap existed between the image he projected and the reception he received. The silence, amplified through the viral clip, was a mirror reflecting his disconnect from a community that once embraced him unconditionally. But there was another layer to the story. Behind the viral clip was a secondary narrative emerging: the letter. Already circulating among the veterans, the letter provided context for the silence. Analysts and journalists began to piece together the connection, realizing that the coordinated restraint had not been random. It had been guided by internal reasoning, carefully documented, and distributed days before the visit. The combination of footage and documentation created a perfect storm, visual proof of disapproval reinforced by written intent. Within hours, The viral clip became the focal point for broader discussions about loyalty, celebrity, and the intersection of public image and personal history. Commentators debated whether Harry could recover from such visible repudiation. Some argued that he had made a tactical misstep, misreading the cultural and institutional context. Others suggested that the viral moment might actually catalyze introspection, forcing him to reckon with past decisions and their consequences. Yet for Harry and his team, the immediate concern remained control. The footage, raw and unalterable, threatened to dominate the narrative indefinitely. No press release could erase what had already been seen. Every gesture, every pause, every muted reaction in that hall was etched into digital memory, accessible to anyone with an internet connection. The silence had transcended the room. It had become a global symbol. And it didn't stop there. The viral clip also caught the attention of other veterans organizations, media outlets, and commentators who had not attended the ceremony. Analysts in the United Kingdom, the United States, and Australia began comparing it to previous appearances, noting how the reception had shifted over time. They highlighted the contrast between Harry's charismatic, award-winning engagements and the cold reception in Toronto. The narrative quickly evolved from a local controversy to an international conversation about credibility, legacy, and the consequences of celebrity choices. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the footage was its timing. Unlike staged images or carefully curated press releases, this single recording captured authenticity. Harry's expectation of applause versus the reality of disciplined indifference. It was unplanned, unfiltered, and undeniable. And in the world of viral media, authenticity trumps narrative control every time. By the end of the day, the footage had reshaped the story. The narrative was no longer about the ceremonial event itself. It was about why the Duke of Sussex had been ignored and what that said about his current standing among the military community. Analysts, journalists, and social media users alike began to reference it as the moment the soldier prince was judged not by title, but by action. And somewhere in the midst of this global attention, a quieter drama was unfolding. The palace, aides, and Harry himself were now aware that the footage had become more than a record. It had become evidence. Evidence that the silence was not an accident, that the visit had been carefully observed, and that the veterans had orchestrated a subtle yet powerful statement of their own. What Harry could not yet know was that the footage was only the beginning. The letter, the whispers, and the unfolding media storm were converging into a narrative that would not only challenge his image, but also his understanding of the very relationships he had relied on for years. The world had seen the silence, but the reasons behind it and the ripple effects it would trigger were only beginning to emerge. Because in media, as in life, a single moment captured on camera can define a story far beyond the room in which it occurred. And what came next would turn that silence into a tidal wave no one could ignore. There's a unique bond forged in battle, one that few outside the military can truly understand. It's not about rank, privilege, or public recognition. It's about trust, loyalty, and knowing, without question, that the person beside you will cover your six when everything falls apart. Prince Harry had once shared that bond. He had trained, deployed, and fought alongside men and women who risked their lives daily, forming a connection that transcended titles and lineage. But by the time he arrived in Toronto for Remembrance Day, that bond had been strained, stretched to the breaking point by choices, distance, and a life increasingly lived in the public eye. Amid the silent room and the viral footage that captivated the world, one voice would soon emerge that reminded Harry and the public that the connection he once relied on was not forgotten. A former comrade, now living quietly in Canada, had served alongside Harry during deployments. He wasn't speaking on camera yet, not for headlines, but he was observing, silently, cataloging every gesture, every word, every subtle expression of resistance from the veterans around him. When he finally spoke, the impact was immediate, piercing through the narrative carefully curated by royal aides. This soldier remembered Harry as the man who led by example, who shared the burden of duty without complaint, who risked everything alongside his team. But he also remembered the divergence. The moment Harry's public persona began to shift, when personal branding, media projects, and celebrity obligations began to take precedence over the quiet, unglamorous work of service. "We fought together," the soldier would later recount in interviews. "We bled together." And then he left. And when he returned, it wasn't the same man. As the ceremonies in Toronto unfolded, the soldier observed the silent protest with a mixture of pride and sadness. Pride that the veterans had collectively asserted themselves without breaking decorum, without disrespecting the institution they served. Sadness because Harry, once one of them, was now isolated in a way he hadn't anticipated. Every disciplined pause, every restrained glance, every unearned silence was a statement, one that the soldier understood far better than anyone else watching from afar. He recalled specific moments from deployments, anecdotes of shared risk and trust that underscored the contrast between then and now. One memory stood out: a night patrol in the deserts of Afghanistan, when their unit had been pinned down by enemy fire. Harry, then a young officer, had moved without hesitation to cover a wounded comrade, placing himself directly in harm's way. That was the Harry they had admired, the Harry whose actions inspired loyalty and respect. The soldier contrasted that heroism with the image projected on stage in Toronto, a man whose courage was unquestionable in history, yet whose current standing relied on optics, not deeds. And so, when he spoke out, the world took notice. His words were precise, measured, and weighted with authority. "I know him," he began in an interview, the tone calm yet unwavering. "I served beside him. I know the man who led with integrity and courage. But the man who stood in Toronto, he's different. He's still the same in parts, but distance, choices, and the world he's embraced have created a gap." And the veterans? They noticed. His testimony offered context that few outside the military could provide. The silence that had sparked global headlines wasn't arbitrary or disrespectful in the traditional sense. It was informed, deliberate, and deeply symbolic. For soldiers who had once fought under Harry's command, the absence of applause was less about rejection and more about reflection. It was a measured response from people who understood the weight of leadership, responsibility, and accountability. And the soldier made that clear. They respect the uniform, they respect the past service, but they cannot endorse choices that they perceive as misaligned with the values we hold. The soldier's words resonated because they bridged the public perception with the internal reality. Outsiders had seen awkward pauses, viral footage, and silent applause. Journalists had speculated on embarrassment, PR mismanagement, and personal failure. But the soldier offered clarity. He framed the silence as a statement of principle, a reflection of standards that could not be compromised even for a prince. This perspective transformed the viral narrative from mere spectacle into a story about values, accountability, and the consequences of choices. He elaborated on the subtle cues that the veterans had employed, details that were invisible to the untrained eye but unmistakable to those who understood military culture. The angle of a salute, the timing of applause, or its deliberate absence, the fleeting exchange of glances, all of these formed a language of quiet protest. To the world, it might have looked like awkwardness or disengagement. To him, it was deliberate, disciplined, and deeply meaningful. And yet, even as he provided these insights, there was empathy. The soldier acknowledged the personal struggle Harry faced, the collision between public expectation, personal history, and the reality of human judgment. "It's not easy," he said. "He's been in the public eye for so long, relied on attention, admiration, affirmation. And then you face silence from people whose opinions mattered most, people you bled and fought with. That hits differently." Behind this perspective lay a more uncomfortable truth. The soldier didn't simply observe, he understood consequences. He knew that the viral clip and public perception could affect Harry's legacy, influence future engagements, and even impact personal relationships. And yet, he also recognized the importance of honesty. Sometimes respect isn't automatic, he reflected. Sometimes silence speaks louder than applause, and if you can't handle that, you're not ready to face the world as it sees you. The soldier's testimony also revealed the broader implications for public perception. Social media had amplified a single moment, turning it into a global event, but context mattered. Without insiders like him to explain the reasons behind the silence, audiences risked misinterpreting intent, misreading nuance. They could assume disrespect where there was careful, measured reflection. And that misinterpretation could distort the narrative in ways that harmed not only Harry's image, but also the reputation of those who had crafted the event with integrity. At the same time, the soldier highlighted the emotional complexity of the veteran's stance. The silence wasn't about anger or spite. It was about accountability, about bridging the gap between past admiration and current expectation. It was about sending a message. Loyalty and respect must be earned continuously, not assumed. In this sense, the silent protest became a lesson not only for Harry but for anyone in a position of leadership, fame, or influence. And perhaps most crucially, the soldier framed the day as a turning point. Harry had long relied on his past achievements to bolster his public persona, yet the Toronto visit exposed a critical reality. Legacy is fragile. The bond that once defined him could not be preserved merely through appearances or ceremonial gestures. It required consistency, alignment with values, and respect for the communities whose lives and opinions mattered most. The soldier's reflections also underscored the irony of Harry's predicament. Once, his presence inspired hope, admiration, and loyalty. Now, the same presence elicited measured silence, public scrutiny, and viral debate. The man who had been a symbol of bravery and service faced a new battlefield, one of perception, credibility, and trust. And in that battlefield, every gesture, every expression, every response, or lack thereof, was scrutinized with relentless intensity.